Right now, there appears to be a real cultural shift happening in this country. For instance, the parent company of Bud Light, Anheuser-Busch, they've lost about $27 billion in market cap since the whole Dylan Mulvaney fiasco. And Bud Light as a brand has just completely nosedived in terms of favorability ratings. Then there's Target, which has lost about $15 billion in market value ever since they decided to place those quote-unquote tuck-friendly swimsuits out for children ahead of Pride Month. Then you have Disney, which has lost about $900 million on their last 8 movie releases, likely because the values presented in those movies no longer appeal to mainstream Americans. And then, most recently, we have the case of Ben & Jerry's ice cream, whose parent company has now lost almost $2 billion of market cap since July 4th. Why July 4th? Well, you see, last week, on July 4th, while most of us were celebrating America's independence with our families and our friends, well, the marketing team over at Ben & Jerry's were not celebrating anything. That's because instead of posting something normal about July 4th, well, here's what the official Ben & Jerry's Twitter account decided to post instead. Quote, "This 4th of July, it's high time we recognize that the U.S. exists on stolen indigenous land and commit to returning it. Learn more and take action now." And then right below that is a graphic which reads this, quote, "The United States was founded on stolen indigenous land. This 4th of July, let's commit to returning it." That is quite a message on America's Independence Day. However, I know what you must be thinking right now. Roman, whoever's running their Twitter account probably just went rogue. Surely, this cannot represent the viewpoint of a billion-dollar publicly traded American company. But that is where you would actually be wrong, evidenced by the fact that if you actually click on the link that was included in that tweet, you're taken to an entire page on the official Ben & Jerry's website, which explains why, according to them, the land underneath Mount Rushmore should be handed back to the Native Americans ASAP. And it's worth mentioning that Ben & Jerry's have thrown their hats into different political issues many times over the last several years. For instance, back in 2017, they stopped serving 2 scoops of the same flavored ice cream over in Australia in order to protest the Australian government's opposition to legalizing same-sex marriage. Then in 2018, they supported thousands of Afghan migrants flooding into Sweden. Later in 2018, they launched a new ice cream flavor called Pecan Resist in order to show their opposition to President Trump. And then in 2021, they stopped selling ice cream in Israel's West Bank in order to supposedly support the Palestinians. And so this July 4th tweet is just the latest in a long line of political activity that was coming from this particular brand. However, this time it's different because amidst the backdrop of these boycotts, like the ones against Bud Light, Target, and Disney, well, it appears that the culture of America has actually shifted. And along that line, calls for boycotting Ben & Jerry's have flooded the internet. And just like the other calls for boycotts, this one, well, it appears to be heavily pushed by conservative mothers, which is a trend that we're actually seeing more and more of. For instance, it was the conservative mothers who pushed the boycott against Target after their Pride Month displays were targeting children. Mothers have also been the ones choosing not to take their kids to see the latest Disney movies because the agendas in those films are not in line with the values held by those families. And now, it appears that conservative mothers are once again pushing this type of a campaign against Ben & Jerry's by either boycotting buying their ice cream and or refusing to take their kids to Ben & Jerry's physical locations. And on top of that, you had several large newspapers, like for instance the New York Post and the Washington Examiner, put out explicit calls for massive boycotts as well. But this is where things, you can say, get a little bit interesting. Because whereas before, in previous years, these conservative calls for boycotts were largely ignored. But that's not the case anymore, evidenced by the fact that the stock price of Unilever, which is the parent company of Ben & Jerry's, tanked. In less than a week, they've lost nearly $2 billion in market cap, with a lot more room to go down. But losing $2 billion was not the only bad news from Ben Cohen and Jerry Greenfield, the founders of Ben & Jerry. Because if you think about it for a moment, if you think back to their July 4th tweet about how America was founded on stolen land and about how it's high time to return that land, well then, if you think about it, you might come to a sudden realization. Ben & Jerry's is a billion-dollar company. They have over 200 locations across the U.S., they have 2 giant ice cream factories, as well as a massive corporate headquarters over in Vermont. And so logically, if they really meant what they said, that it's high time to return American land to the natives, well, they themselves happen to own a considerable amount of land that they themselves could return right away. In fact, if you follow their logic, and trace it back to the 17th century, you'll find that the land underneath Ben & Jerry's current headquarters was at one time inhabited by the Cossack Abenaki nation. At one time, the Abenaki territory stretched all the way from Massachusetts over to Quebec. And right there in the middle is the location which currently happens to be the Ben & Jerry's headquarter campus. And wouldn't you believe it? Soon after their July 4th tweet, one of the current tribal chiefs of this Native American nation, well, he came out and he said that he would be quite interested in taking that land back. Here's specifically what Mr. Don Stevens, who is the current chief of the Nulhagan Band of the Cossack Abenaki Nation, here's what he said in an interview with Newsweek magazine. Quote, "We are always interested in reclaiming the stewardship of our lands throughout our traditional territories and providing opportunities to uplift our communities. The tribe has not been approached in regards to any land back opportunities from Ben & Jerry's. If and when we are approached, many conversations and discussions will need to take place to determine the best path forward for all involved." And along that line, the Abenaki Nation are scheduled to have a meeting today over in Quebec in order to discuss exactly this, the reclamation of their ancestral land. And yet, here's the funny thing. Even with this perfect opportunity before them, no one over at Ben & Jerry's has yet issued a public response about whether or not they'll be returning this land. We here at the Epoch Times, of course, reached out to them for comment, but have yet to hear back. And perhaps the reason that we have yet to hear back is because Mr. Ben Cohen has been a bit busy getting arrested in front of the Department of Justice over in Washington, D.C. You see, just yesterday, during a protest in support of Julian Assange, Ben Cohen, as well as several other left-wing protesters, they blocked the entrance of the Justice Department building and they were burning some props in effigy, making the point that the freedom of press was under attack. Ben Cohen was then subsequently arrested, but released a few hours later, meaning in practical terms that he has had now a full 24 hours to get back to the Indian chief about whether or not to return the land. But as of right now, nothing has yet been announced. And so that is currently the situation that's playing itself out in regards to Ben & Jerry's, which, if you take a step back and look at the full tapestry, it appears to really be part of a larger trend of these conservative boycotts that are really having an effect by hurting the bottom line of corporations. And then until next time, I'm your host, Roman from the Epoch Times. Stay informed. Most importantly, stay free.